Tego Agogo, Tego Agogo. You want a banger you can dance to, one to really shake your pants to.
I want to first of all thank you for joining my show and for taking
I'm
the
happy to
time.
be here.
But I'm really fascinated in your case, not just as an independent musician, Terry, as well as an admiration for your style of music. What I like is the fact that you used to be an elementary teacher.
Yes, I was for about 26 years, actually. My undergraduate is actually in music, but when I started teaching elementary school, in that case, you teach all subjects. In the case of me, all subjects except French. But I incorporated as much music as I could into the curriculum in all areas, whether it was math, language, whatever. So music was always part of it. But in my undergrad, what I focused the most on in music was composition. That was
Hmm.
my main interest, not performance, composition specifically. And so I brought a lot of that into the classroom, and I enjoyed the years of teaching I had. And then when I decided I was sort of finished with that phase of my life, that phase of my career, I decided to spend more time with music. I was still doing it part-time, even while I was teaching full-time, but I decided to spend my later years focused on my writing, my own music and promoting it. So that's what I've been doing since I left teaching, which is about 10 years ago now.
It's fascinating to me because I have the pleasure of being close with a number of musicians whose philosophy of life echoes this sentiment that music should be part of everything, including the way it is taught to students. And as somebody who spent 26 years, which is a considerable time in his life, helping with the what is essentially in this new age that we live in, a very difficult thing to do, which is get students' attention spans, get them pointing at you and listening to what you have to say.
Right.
How do you feel that experience impacted your ability as as a true musician now? Because what I see now is a version of Terry that is really reaping the rewards of patience and discipline in structuring something that is an echo of your nature. Tell me about how it influenced you directly as a musician from being surrounded by all those young, impressionable minds, leaving an impact on them, and then finding maybe yourself being impacted the most.
Well, I think I was impacted because kids are they're a great audience to run things by because there's no filter, there's nothing, there's no it's either they like it or they don't, or they respond to it or they don't. So if you're trying out, say for example, something new that you've written or even just a piece that you've chosen, you very quickly find out whether this is going to go across, whether it's going to be something they're going to embrace and that you can continue to play with them and sing with them, or if it's something that's just not going to cut it, and then you just simply go for something else. So you have that instant feedback, that instant, well, criticism, if you want to call it. They're not usually that heartless or blunt, but it just you just see the physical reaction, you just see it in the faces, and so that has helped guide me. You know, I usually I like when I write something, I usually have a sounding board. In this case, oftentimes my wife at some part of a composition I'll have as a sounding board, and then it won't necessarily always steer me into what path it should take. I tend to listen to my gut for that, an instinct over many years of doing it. But kids are definitely more of an immediate response that they will not hide. So that has certainly helped me going forward in terms of just taking chances, but being aware that this may not work for everyone.
It is interesting that it's having an impact for certain on the desire of families and parents with kids to focus on giving them a chance to learn an instrument, to understand the purity and power of music. I mean, I look around the hinterlands where I'm situated and I see every little small town now having a music store or having
Right.
some kind of community driven effort to preserve orchestral experiences, to preserve performance involving instrumentation that gives children a sense of self-esteem and empowerment. Is it
Right.
my imagination, or is this renaissance really happening, Terry, when it comes to the impact of organic music versus leaving your head in the clouds with the iPad?
Yeah, I haven't observed that as much as you have. I may not have traveled to all the places that I am encouraged when I hear of group ensembles in different cities, and I certainly support music education. I know some other people that do as well. I all I can say, I guess, is that I hope that's the direction it's going. I do have concerns, of course, with AI coming in into the forefront, and I personally don't believe it has any place in the arts, as lots of other places maybe and applications in our life, but I don't. I don't favor it in the arts. I feel that if you really need that assistance to create something, maybe you should be looking at a different field.
Those are truer words, I think, never been spoken. You hear a lot of criticism now of AI for the fact that rather than using it to amplify what you already have, which is fair for a lot of musicians who don't have access to capital and money, and for them, AI maybe allows them to get to spots of exposure they didn't get to. I think
Right.
there's nothing more frustrating when you hear a musician listen to another musician and say, that's a lot of digitech. That's a lot
Yeah.
of AI influenced talent. And I agree with you, Terry. I think there's something to be said for the fact that there are no shortcuts in music, right? It's for every entertainer, there's this understanding that to be a true entertainer, you have to have equal parts musical talent with a true natural talent. And that's something AI can't replace, right?
No, absolutely. And I mean, even some of the showcases that I participate in, the indie music showcases, they have a set of guidelines, and one of those guidelines is no AI music or AI assisted works. Now, again, it's getting to the point where it's going to be hard for them to police that. So it comes to a certain point that you have to take the word of the person submitting it about whether or not they've done this on their own. Even for me, I mean, I have a have a history, I have a discography, but at the same time, it will eventually come down to do I trust this person if they're telling me that they've created this solely on their own? And that's the hard part. I know they're trying to invent software that's going to try to recognize these components in music, but I mean, what if AI writes the piece for you and then you hire musicians to play it? I don't see how they're going to get around that. That's a tough one. But you're hearing it even in well, you're in media, you're hearing it in television, you're hearing it in movies, you hear, and at this point, I find when I listen to things, it seems painfully obvious to me that this is not a human being that created this. It just doesn't have that either emotional resonance or sometimes just not even a logical sequence of things. Um, but that's where we are at this point. I have no idea what's going to happen going forward. I guess we're all kind of waiting to see.
It almost seems like for whatever contempt of the understanding and realization that it's AI is an even worse disdain for the conformity, for the fact that there will be people who will go along with it because music does have a way of touching everyone.
Right.
If you recall, and this is dating our age here, it's going way back in time, but if you remember during the era of the Milli Vanilli controversy,
Yes.
at least there was some solace in knowing that even though the two faces of the band were taking credit for its creation, it was still a human creation. And I might add, a really fantastic one. I mean, some of those songs really resonated with people, which is
Right.
why there was so much sadness when they learned that it was all just, smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. Yeah. And the element of it all for me, because I know I am somebody that even though I'm independent, I will produce my demos at home and I will write out scores, charts for musicians if I'm preparing to go record. But then I actually go to a physical recording studio still to do my work. But everything's done at home so that when I go in there, I'm pretty much ready. I know I have a good idea of what I'm to save time, save money, of course, all those things. But um, I think it's important for me. The biggest part of this, the most exciting part of it for me, really is the creation aspect. And so, yes, I mean, if I watch a movie, if I see a program of some sort and I find the music intriguing on some level, the first thing I want to know is who wrote it. I don't care so much about who performed it because there's many people that are highly skilled that can perform anything. Not so much for the creational part of things though. So I'm always interested, and if I hear a song I like, usually it's an older song, but even still, and if it had a face, like you mentioned, Milli Vanilli, if it had a face in front of it that was the singer, I'm usually highly suspect of whether or not they wrote the song. So then I'll research and find out, oh, okay, that was that songwriter, and then that's the person who I become more interested often in the writer than the performer.
Fascinating, especially considering that every era is almost like a biorhythmical charting of advances in technology colliding with originality of human beings. You could look to the
Yes,
50s and 60s and 70s to see that. There was
right.
still so much room for freedom of expression and interpretation. And then starting in the 80s, one started to feel that everything got commodified, packaged, and that the response in the 90s, in particular grunge, was to go against that grain. And then
Yeah,
in the end, it still suffocated the industry. And I think today, whether you're a fan of the Rick Beatos or professors of rock on YouTube, or,
right.
I have so many different contacts that I keep in touch with where I get news from the industry. And Terry, is it me? It just seems like it's calamity out there, as you said, with no sense of fairness or a police element to make sure that there isn't cheating. It's a pretty cutthroat industry now, isn't it, at the highest level?
It is, and this is why I guess part of the reason I gravitate towards some of these indie showcases and people that are working there because they all share a similar philosophy. They don't really care about mainstream this or mainstream that. So you could hear a really wide cross section of musical genres that you're not going to hear in any sort of mainstream format these days. And thankfully, there are still a lot of community and college stations across Canada and the US that do play a wide variety and seek that. They seek things outside of the norm in addition to playing things that are within inside, the norm. But it's funny, you mentioned music from the different decades, 50s, 60s, 70s. For me, yes, the 80s is when things started to go off the rails. I attribute it mostly to synthesizers because if you watch a film from the 80s, for example, something like Terminator, okay, James Cameron film, I like the film. I can't stand listening to the music score. It's appalling. It was just someone sitting with a synth, and that was the extent of the score. And it's, yeah, exactly like a turtle walking on the keys or a cat. And that's what it comes across as, and it's very difficult to listen to today. Whereas if you jump back a few other decades, I hear music in film and in television that I would actually purchase to listen to independent of the visual medium because it's so well done. These are people that were trained. These are people that understand. They had a level of understanding when they approached their craft. And it's
These
a
are
big,
people who defined a genre. I mean, I
yes,
think back up to the ultimate experience cinematically with music for me was the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns and hearing the great
yes,
Ennio Morricone
absolutely.
creating tapestries and soundscapes that, let's face it, Terry, defined a film that when you hear it to this day,
Absolutely.
you think to yourself, yeah, that's the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Absolutely. The other person at that time period, for me, even I gravitated more towards was Bernard Herrmann,
Mm.
who wrote with the Hitchcock films and Taxi Driver and tons of television in the 50s and 60s. Twilight Zone, some great scores he did for the Twilight Zone. So people like that are actually some of my biggest influences. So if I gravitate to listening, I don't do a lot of recreational listening these days. I tend to listening for me, whether I want to or not, tends to be more educational. Tends to be okay. Well, what can I glean from this or learn from this? So these are the sort of things I would tend to seek out. And although I do listen to or have listened to a lot of pop and rock music and started with that when I was 15, 14, um, I also spent the time in university was all spent immersed in, for want of a better term, classical music. So
Mm.
that's what if I want to learn something or understand something or improve what I do, I'm going to go to Stravinsky before I go to Taylor Swift. That's what it is for me. No.
For you, I would imagine also the fact that the space between the 70s transitioning to 80s and 90s cinematography and filmmaking, we had the rise of the true beneficiaries of that influence, like the John Williams and the Hans Zimmers and the Thomas Newmans, who again found a way to score a film to amplify it. Whereas today, it's going back to that era where in the 80s, I agree with you, there were too many science fiction and fantasy films ruined by the flood of the almost aching mellotronic keyboard sound mixed with filtering techniques like Dolby that ended up destroying all nuanced sound altogether, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and a lot of that music at that time period. I mean, uh, it was just it was something that just sat there. And it was of course cheap. I mean, it was easy to hire one person sitting at a synth, give us a score, give us something. We'll pay you for your time. We don't have to hire an orchestra. We don't have to hire all these musicians. So it was really a budget thing to me, which unfortunately killed its future watching enjoyability, I guess you'd say. Really for me anyway, because the music is a huge component of a lot of the films. So, and listening to just what appears oftentimes as noodling on a synthesizer just doesn't quite convey the atmosphere you get from a chamber orchestra or a small ensemble or a large orchestra.
And the fact that you're able to look at it analytically, almost as an engineer in understanding how it's constructed, while also having an affinity for the quality that is created is a rare thing now, because I think we've lost those standards. I think the reason movies have suffered is for that ample
Right.
reason that there isn't a focus on the full artistry. And, let's talk about you now. You're someone who, for many years, was just an instrumentalist, and
Mhm.
now you become a vocalist again. And I had the chance to listen to some of your work, Terry. I love everything I hear because it sounds highly original and constructed in a way where you have the professor's mind, the teacher's mind. You want to create something that is not just stylistically impressive, but will hopefully leave and resonate with someone in their heart. So tell me about the way people perceive you now. When you introduce yourself and they say, Terry, what kind of music do you play? And you're forced to kind of almost pigeonhole yourself. What do you say to new admirers and followers?
What I usually say is that I'm primarily an instrumental composer, guitarist, in that order. Composer first, guitarist second, even though that's my main instrument. Primarily an instrumental composer, guitarist whose music floats between Latin, jazz, and rock, but have been known to go outside of those parameters many times. Um, as far as singing goes, it had been maybe 14, maybe 16 years since I had actually sung on any recordings. And I honestly didn't miss it. I've always had a great affinity for instrumental music because a lot of the music I'm passionate about, from the Romantic era and the modern 20th century orchestral composers, a lot of it's instrumental. So I gravitate towards that. So it was an easy transition for me. I started off writing I started off actually submitting music to publishers in everything from new country to folk rock in the 90s. And I reached a point of, I was never a confident singer, don't consider myself really a singer. It's always been out of necessity. So once I left that behind and had a long period of time for instrumental music, for this particular EP I just released, there were two songs where I felt, okay, it was calling for something, a vocal of some sort. So I said, unfortunately, these two pieces seem too original to me or too unique to me to let somebody else sing them, even though that would have been ideally my preference. So I said, okay, I'll spend the time, try to get back into it, and see if I could do these two pieces justice. And that's where I'm at.
That
I don't foresee a vocal career going forward. My next piece will probably be instrumental, but I'm glad I did these two things.
And I'm glad that you decided to interpret it through your own unique process. I recall having spoken in a previous interview with the great Steve Poltz about when he wrote You Were Meant for Me with Jewel, and the
Mhm.
fact that obviously she became an international star after singing it. But for the man who created it, when I hear his version, I find it absolutely delightful. It's almost
Right.
revelatory. There are a lot of people in the industry that people don't realize who are admirers of them that took their songs from other people and interpreted it accordingly.
Absolutely.
I think, though, in this day and age, there's a lot to be said for people discovering you with every level of originality, including the interpretation of vocals. I think your vocals come across as having a certain energy and a real passion from where it comes that maybe you don't get that if someone does it, professionally and takes your work and
Very
interprets it
true.
their way.
And oftentimes, when I was submitting to music to publishers, that's exactly what it was. I was hiring people that sang country or people that sang a certain style really well. And so those are the people that were representing my songs to publishers. I didn't sing much of that myself. I did all the music and instrumentation on my own at home back then. But yes, it was. I enjoyed the process for these particular songs. It was fun, and I had a concept, an idea, and I wanted to follow it through. And I realized, I have to do this, regardless. I have to take a chance and do this. And as far as where the ideas come from, as I said, my music often blends Latin because I grew up in a family that played a lot of music from South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So even though by the time I reached adolescence, I couldn't listen to it. I hated it. It was all rock by that point. I loved it as a young kid. And then I came full circle back into it in my late 20s and 30s. And I love the music from those cultures. So I found a way of infusing that in a way with my other background in rock and classical music as well. Found some sort of blend. But I'm really all over the place genre-wise in terms of my influences. Everything from Kate Bush to Beatles to Zappa to Stravinsky. It's really a very wide palette. And I didn't intend it to be that way. It's just what I've gravitated towards over time.
And you mentioned South America, growing up Guyanese in
Yes.
cultural background. Um, when I think of people's influences and asking them who influenced you, I'm very acutely aware that there's a big difference between learning about Angus Young first over a Frank Zappa versus learning about, say, Jimmy Page over a John McLaughlin. Each
Yes.
will take you down a different path. But the
Absolutely.
reason I really enjoy the Zappas of the world and the Prince, the princes of the world, is because they're just such powerful unicorns. They're not just guitarists. They literally live and breathe as if the guitar is an appendage of sorts. Who were
Yes.
your big guitar and vocal influences that you think most likely shaped the kind of music you're creating and writing and producing today?
Well, as far as guitar players, some of the ones you mentioned, I mean, I did start out, I will say a caveat though. A lot of the music I grew up listening to in my teens that I loved and was passionate about, and this includes a lot of Canadian acts, everything from Rush,
Mm.
Triumph, Max Webster, Saga, a lot of these bands. The guitarists of these bands were my idols at the time, including, Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin. However, these days, when I look back, a lot of people oftentimes they can only really enjoy a lot of the say rock music they grew up listening to. I'm kind of the opposite. I have a very hard time going back to a lot of it, but there are exceptions. I would say Kim Mitchell and Max Webster, specifically his stint with that band, is something I can still enjoy today. I just found his guitar playing always out of the box, always unique, and he's somebody I respect a lot. Um, some of the other things, like mentioned Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin. I used to, I was really heavily into these bands, but now there are a few songs I admire him more as a writer than a guitar player. I mean, and a producer. He did a great production job on a lot of their records too.
It's great you brought up Saga. You talk about a criminally underrated Canadian
Yes.
musical band. Everybody talks about Geddy Lee and Rick Emmett, and
Yeah.
grew up with them both, love both their vocal application. But Michael Sadler, if you listen to some
Yes.
of the early Saga stuff, he is almost operatic.
Yes.
And I
Pretty
think
much.
and I think that as Canadians, we were spoiled by that because today I don't think anybody even remembers Saga for the most part, with apologies to all the Saga fans. But the truth is, it wasn't quite the level of exposure of a Triumph or a Rush.
Unless it
Spe-
was Europe. They were
Unless
quite
it was
big,
Europe,
very big in
absolutely.
Europe. Yeah,
Well, let's face it, it's why the John McLaughlins and the Robert Fripps of the world love touring in Europe, because something about putting on their experimental progressive music was always better received, I think, than with some audiences over in the States who like the more, country rock, Rolling Stones, Beatles influence that would come later. I was going to ask you that, for you, these are fascinating influences because, as you said, they were creators. They weren't just instrumentalists, really proficient at their craft, but
right.
they could compose. I mean, Richie Blackmore is another example. People like talking about him as just a guitarist or instrumentalist of bands because he never sung, but he would literally write everything. And he'd be
Yeah.
that one musician who would tell the band, look at me and let me tell you how we can make this done
Right.
successfully, right?
Another person that leaps out at that time, as I said, I mentioned Max Webster because of I always drawn to that quirkiness and his playing ability. But I also liked Steve Morse a lot, as I went through a strong period of the Dixie Dregs when I was younger. At the time I was listening to it, I couldn't play it at all, but I enjoyed a lot of things. But again, over time, and probably as a result of having a music study and classical music overall, it changed my opinions away from a lot of the stuff I grew up with. Even though occasionally there are still things I do enjoy, a lot of it feels like music I enjoyed as a teen. And then Rush is a prime example. I saw them in concert many times, absolutely love them. I have a very difficult time listening to a lot of Rush today. A handful of maybe three or four songs possibly, but definitely not what it was. It just doesn't resonate with me as it did when I was a teen.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because we were talking earlier about the rise of the 80s keyboards. For me as a Rush fan, it was always Signals, the one album that made me scratch my head because I felt it was probably their greatest constructed album. But because they had the heavy Dolby and the Mellotron ambience there to overwhelm Alex's guitar, you listen
Yes,
to it now and you say, oh man, I think it was Terry Brown who did a remix of that album to kind of show people what he would have done differently. And it's like you said, production value gets lost sometimes. And people forget that in order to catch lightning in a bottle, it can't just be wonderfully sounding notes and great vocals. It has to be a good engineer. And what
yes.
I love about the way you approach your music is you are that engineer. In your mind, you've already layered out where you want everything to be and how you want it to be heard.
I do plan carefully, but at the same time, it's experience has taught me that when I go to the studio to record, to have a solid plan, be pretty clear about what you want, but also leave a percentage open for the opinions of other musicians and your engineer that you're working with, because things happen sometimes as you're going through that process and say, hey, wait a second, this is much better idea than what I had originally. So I try to keep an openness as well to those moments when things are recording that will result in a better piece of music overall. I try to keep open to that as well.
Well, Terry, this has been an absolute pleasure knowing that you are not just a true music historian and a student of the art, but that it seems to me like you've hit a good place. This is now a good time for Terry to step out and make others appreciate not just your love and passion for music, but the fact that you're someone who still retains this spark after all these years, which is so very important during tough times.
It is important to have that, I think. And again, if you're part of a community where a lot of people share that, it helps. It helps keep you grounded in that way as well. But thank you. I appreciate talking to you. It's been great to reflect on these things, and I hope I'll have the opportunity to do that again in the future with you. And as far as it is a bit of a brave new world going forward, and we'll have to wait and see what really happens with all of this stuff. But this is what keeps me grounded in the geniuses of the past, let's say. You know.
And the feeling is truly mutual. Continued success, my friend, and let's talk again very soon.
Okay, will do. Take care. Bye for now.